So the podcast is for anyone who kind of feels at that point in life where they maybe have an idea, they maybe have a starting point of what they want to do and where they want to go in life. And this is the podcast kind of for you to kind of find that inspiration, that motivation to kind of take charge of your own life again. And maybe you found it, maybe you're like halfway on the way to going somewhere, and to just keep going and to have faith in kind of that path of yours, regardless of what that passion is. To kind of have faith and to feel like it is okay, regardless of whether that's a small, I run a creative workshop, or whether I'm doing a big project. Like, there is something that you can do that you're passionate about that can make a positive change in the world, and you know, pay your bills and put food on the table. And you can find a way to do that. And yeah, just, yeah, it's also an escape from kind of the constant bombardment of things going on today, and just to find something that is a bit constructive, a bit positive, a bit encouraging, a bit motivational, if that's what you need in your life. Since I was a child, my mum was kind of very lefty, and kind of, raised me into that it's important to stand up for yourself and stand up for others. So my first memories of protests were going to housing protests, local ones in Lambeth, when they were shutting down kind of council housing, and kind of just local couple hundred people marching against that. And then in 2020, when there was not much to do, and everything with George Floyd happened, that kind of, I went to that first initial week of protests. And I remember the one protest where we got run down by a bunch of horses, and I went back home and I watched the BBC footage, and they played everything backwards, and, kind of told the true story out of order to kind of make it look as if the crowd were the aggressors in the situation. And then that made me want to make my own protest, which was just, I was like, I'm tired of just chanting the same things over and over. I was like, we need a microphone. We've got to actually speak beyond just chants and slogans, because there's this, that doesn't say much or do much for anyone. And also we need to kind of, yeah, we need to shift this kind of, I just felt that first week kind of the tension between the police and the protesters was just building and building up. Um, and then, yeah, that's how I got involved with that initially with Black Lives Matter. And for me, kind of, I'm a very intersectional person anyway. So then I was like, let's work with other groups and people and bring everyone together. And then I went on a tour around the country with 20 musicians that we crowdfunded, because I also was like, we're preaching to the converted here in London. So let's take this where it's really needed. And then, yeah, then after that, obviously, then during that winter, the next lockdown, we found out about the protest bill and all of that was going on. So I was very involved in the Kill the Bill campaign. And then I think from there, kind of, as I alluded to earlier, kind of saw the response that we got from the government was nothing to do with responding to what different campaigners were asking for in terms of changing laws and making sure that vulnerable people are protected, but that they kind of went in the opposite direction instead. And while I know we're going to crack down the activists and pass more suppressive laws, so that kind of, there was a lot going on there as well with other activists in terms of intimidation and things like that, that just kind of made me rethink everything and be like, how do I make more of a change? Because then, yeah, we just saw the same stories happening still. So I kind of felt very useless in the activist space and didn't know how much that was going to really change things in 2020. So that was where I kind of decided to transition into doing something more with media and with arts, and finding a way with that way to kind of get into the homes of people who we can't reach by being out on the streets. We're seeing with what's happening in places like Nepal, for example, that it's often not the marches themselves, but it's often when the state responds with violence to the marches. That's often the times when those marches have then made a difference, is that, people peacefully marching and allowing the state to be the clear perpetrators of violence, and then that then forces the state to change. which for me is very tragic. And I don't want to be there on that day when 20 something people die and hundreds of people get injured. It's already just having seen people get attacked by police at protests, that just one person is already hurts enough, you know? And yeah, I think again, with the media landscape being the way it is, that also takes a lot of it out of it because it allows states to kind of shape the picture of what's happening at protests and allows them to tell the story of how they want it to be told. And more often than not, puts the protesters in places of aggression when a lot of the time we know that there's things like infiltration going on in crowds, and things like that to kind of, yeah, incite. So I think that states and police forces overall are too well practiced and rehearsed now. I don't think they'll allow something like the 60s and the 70s and 80s to happen again in the way that it did. Even the same with the miners' strikes here, when you go back, I mean, kind of you study the history of protests, and I think we studied it as a people, but that, you know, neglect to think that the state and police forces have also studied it, and they are resistant to that change ultimately. So we have to kind of come up with new methods to create that change, I think, as people. Not to say that protesting isn't amazing and good and a great way to kind of get your feelings out and get a message out, but I think that it needs to evolve. And I don't know what that is, but here we are. That you again, it reaches you with people that are like-minded, and it reminds you how many people do feel and think like you in similar ways. And also it is, I won't say it's not. When we did that tour around the country, we went to Brighton, Bristol, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham. And we had people coming up at those protests who initially came up and were like, "All lives matter," and kind of were hostile, or people who stopped and kind of then came up towards the end and were like, we just heard a song, or we just saw a dance, or we just saw someone performing a poem, and then we didn't realize what this was." And that drew us in. And at first we didn't understand anything about Black Lives Matter, for example, or about environmentalism, or I had a lot of ones where I was doing LGBT speeches at Black Lives Matter Pride and had older Black people coming up and didn't realize there was so much racism within that gay community. And you know, that it definitely is being there in person as opposed to being behind a keyboard or reading a comment. You know, we forget that communication is 2% the words we use, which is basically online communication, and 98% is our tone of voice, our body language, everything else. And that is all taken out when we're speaking online, unless we're watching a video. And even then, it's our attention spans are so short. There's so many people talking at us. It's just not comparable with connecting with people in person. So I definitely think that there's a lot of power in protest there, like you said, and in community and in connecting with people. But then for kind of the bigger challenges we have, it's also how do we, yeah, bring that energy? And I think, yeah, speaking in podcasting, it allows some of that things to come back in, and being able to watch people online. For me, it's there's some people that I watch that are amazing inspiration who create video essays, for example, and talk about topics where I'm able to learn so much. So I think that that's, and we see it as well for people being kind of radicalized to the right, and a lot of that happens through that medium of media as well. So I think, yeah, there's so much needed there as well for people that don't necessarily go out, don't take part in community, which there's a lot of people of who have a massive loneliness crisis. So, and for those people, they find their community online and through listening to people there. So we need to also reach out to those people as well. I did see a headline that said that watching short form content is more about as damaging to the brain as drinking. And there is something to that. When I don't personally scroll through things like Instagram or TikTok. I can't. It does something to my brain that just, the kind of switch between atmosphere and music and lighting and person, like it's so jarring because you'll go from something completely unserious to something really, really, really serious to something just out there and kooky, and then back, and it's I can't. process so many realities at once. And for me, it's a lot. So I like something long form. I can't always finish something long form, but if I do get into a topic, I want to kind of explore it as well. And I'm kind of, for me, I think that builds, that's part of the empathy. And I think when you watch things short form constantly, and you only see, you know, again, kind of that headline flashing out at you, it becomes so easy to not look at the whole picture. And it becomes so easy to misunderstand anything and the way our algorithms are set up as well. And I think that's, you know, a huge thing that we're all lacking on every side of everything is a lot of empathy. And everyone's kind of saying that as well and screaming and asking for it. Everyone's like, the whole world is screaming, I'm not being understood, I'm not being heard. And therefore just digging their heels in more into their little camps and entrenchments. Um, when yeah, it's I find it interesting. I will listen to anyone, kind of, even the people that I disagree with and that whose conversations can make my skin crawl, but I have an interest to understand where you're coming from, at least, so that if I meet you in real life we can have an actual real discussion, because I can disagree with someone on 99 points and they might still have one point that I'm like, hey, we have common ground here. You know, we might both just agree that, you know, the climate crisis is real, we need to do something about it. Or that, you know, single parents deserve support, or that children need a better education. There's always things that you can find with humans where we go, we actually agree on this, or we actually like the same food. So we're not that different. And sometimes it takes time to discover that. But I think it is so important. I kind of saw that whole controversy recently about Laverne Cox dating NYPC police officer, and people are like, how can you, as a black trans celebrity, date a Trump supporting white, blonde, blue eyed NYPC police officer and have a long term relationship with each other? But I think, yeah, it's kind of, we lose sight of that humanity of that this is humans, opposites attract. Humans have been different for a long time, have disagreed with each other for a long time, but there's definitely something about, since social media has popped up, we've become so divided and so kind of like, you stay over here and I'll stay over here, which is not healthy or helping anything. 0.1% of the population or less than. And so you can't have, of course, 80% of the population has never met a trans person before in their life. And now, like you said, it's become so hyper fixated and kind of thrown. And it's hilarious because I'm in one hand sense, I'm like, you know, when has any of you ever been in a bathroom with a trans person? But all of you care about it all of a sudden. And it's hard to kind of, having grown up in small town Germany, you know, it's kind of, I often have this conversation, and being Afro-German, having that kind of family where we kind of grew up with these things of, there's a difference between hateful ignorance and, you know, ignorance by, I just have never been around this, have never seen this, no one around me has ever been around this, has ever talked about this, and now through social media or through media in general, and it's the same playbook that has been around since, you know, the Italians first started weaponizing media for the purpose of fascism. But it's that, you know, that fear playbook of find something, identify something different, make that isn't present, but you can make it a looming threat and then scare everyone about it, you know? Um, but yeah, the only way to resolve that is through conversation. It's hard. Like, I had a friend who spoke to me, called me up once and was like, "Oh, they have an LGBT nursery in Berlin. What are they doing with the kids?" And I was just like, "It's in Berlin. There's perhaps lots of LGBT parents there who are raising children, and obviously it's not a normal situation." I kind of had to be like, explain, you know, this is probably for the kids to be okay from a young age with having mum and dad and dad. And then he was like, "Oh," and I was like, "Did you read it? You know, I mean, what did you think was going on?" That this, you know, like, I get why in the headline, and but again, in that media, or that atmosphere of fear that the media has kind of created, and of alienation, kind of leads people to kind of jump to these wild assumptions and not have the curiosity to look into it and be like, "Oh, this makes complete sense," you know? I actually see why this would exist. But yeah, it's kind of that exact same thing over and over again in so many ways. And I think, yeah, long form conversations or content, if people don't want to read, understand the articles and books, then hopefully by speaking to them and discovering them in some way, shape, or form, then at least you come to some kind of understanding of where that comes from. Or at least an understanding where you're like, oh, I feel less threatened by this now. Gentrification played a part in that as well, because I don't think it's necessary that when they did start seeing black and brown faces pop up, that it was just, all of a sudden refugees have popped up. I think it's the displacement of a lot of people from the bigger cities, especially at London, who have then gone, okay, I'm going to take that council house in X place in London, and you have kind of, because I speak to people outside who are like, oh, for a friend in South End who's like, I'm seeing so many more people arrive from London specifically, and particularly black and brown people to South End because they can't afford to live in London anymore, but they can commute from. So you are seeing that, but it's not actually necessarily new immigrants either who are coming in from abroad in the country. And yeah, that change in demographics is everywhere in the world as well. And that's another thing that I kind of see as a person who's not actually from the UK, grew up living in different places, friends everywhere. I find it fascinating how similar that argument is in different places and completely different populations, different structures, different interplays. And it reminded me of this video I watched about the idea of nationhood and how that is a very, very recent idea that we've only just come up with in the past 200 years or so. And then when you actually look at a map of the world by genetic diversity, et cetera, you see it completely contradicts any of the maps that or lines that we've drawn for ourselves. Humans have always been incredibly diverse, spoken a lot of languages, traveled. It's just now the speed of travel is a lot faster. And we've now added this new idea into the mix of we are all a nation and we all have this mystical shared history that doesn't really exist, but has apparently existed for thousands of years. And we've all been Great British when, the Britain has been an island of constant waves of migration and conquering, going back thousands of years when the Romans first started taking over. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting place to be in. But I think one of the main breakdowns that has led to all of this is just the breakdown of the education system. And we talk about how bad it is in, for example, the States, but it's very, very similar in Europe as well. And I think people have neglected that since the 2000s in particular, the education system has really gone down the drain. And unless you are going to a fancy private school somewhere, everything is a lot more focused for a lot of kids. If you listen to them, everything is more focused on their behavior. It's focused on them. There's not a lot of education and interesting people and topics. And there's so many kids in the West. I grew up between here and Africa, and I left just after I did my GCSEs and spent a year in Africa. And even then in 2005, six, it struck me because I came from an environment where everyone was like, oh, school, I don't want to go. I don't want to do this. I'm not interested in learning, to a place where everyone was like, all I want to do is go to school. I wish I could go to school and learn. And, that we've made expanding our minds for so many people an unattractive thing, or something they don't want to do. And especially in any kind of that whole thing they talk about not trusting experts anymore, or anyone that's some form of authority figure, because I think that starts going back to I don't like my teacher. And there's this, yeah, mistrust of authority that's both in one way good and bad, because obviously we all have this intrinsic understanding that we live in a system that's not built for us. But then also it's like, where do we then turn to for the people who are like, I don't know what to do about that, and I don't trust any authority figure or expertise, regardless of whether it's good or bad. It's hard to figure out who's telling me the right thing, which is why some people are like, okay, I can actually discern and fall into and decide that I need to maybe go to this or that. And some people are like, I need to go to a Tommy Robinson protest because he knows what's going on and will save me and my family from whatever. I think it reaches them as they become young adults. I'm the oldest brother of two younger sisters, so I kind of see that transition slowly happening in them as well. Where I think and I think that's very natural. I think kids are, we kind of complain that our kids have lost their attention span. But I think kids are just have always been like that anyway. I remember being a child. Possibly I have ADHD, so, but they, I think that's just the fact that the world is still new. You know, you see that with animals as well, young animals who are just like, oh my God, this, oh my God, that. You know, I think it's that, you know, everything is still new and interesting and fascinating. And I think when you transition to that place where you have to start paying rent and bills and working and things, then you start having questions where you're just like, wait, no, I might have superficially known about something, but now it's kind of becoming real, and I actually really want to get into the meat and bones of XYZ issue and understand what is a tax and why do I have to pay it, or you know. And I think that that transition into young adulthood always brings out, like you said, that curiosity a little bit more. And then yeah, there's a lot of conversations again I have with my little sisters where then they're like, you know, why didn't I learn about XYZ in school, or why didn't they make this interesting, or da da da. And then yeah, for me as an older brother who kind of went through that same system from when they were younger, I would be like, you know, this, think about it this way and this, and it's really interesting now having them come back and be like, you actually told me to think about this ages ago, or you brought this up, or told me something that sometimes I forgot that I told them, and they'll be like, yeah, I'm so glad you said that to me when I was younger because now I see it everywhere, you know. And yeah, I think we have to play a part in that as well, you know. It's not just us, but also and or not just the education system, but also us as humans around people, that we have to kind of fill the voids in that, I guess, and push people's curiosity to be a little bit more in depth, especially once they're growing up and while they're younger. Because I think once the brain's kind of set and done developing around 25, that's when you can kind of see it's a lot harder to encourage people into that change. And I also know people for whom, yeah, that kind of long form content is just not interesting or appealing, and that's also okay. But I think, yeah, it will happen. And some kids are naturally into it already. And I think a lot of them, as they grow up, they become more and more interested in longer form things and finding out. And it depends on the subject as well. And I think that's kind of the challenge for the person such as myself trying to make it, is keeping it interesting for that long period of the time. I think a lot of people kind of want you to keep it as short as possible. And I think there's a kind of a fear, but I think um, in so many ways, I think things like long form YouTube videos or podcasts have replaced the radio for a generation. So where people used to listen into the radio, now they're just like, and I do this myself, where I'll be like, okay, I need to, you know, clean my house or write a whole bunch of emails and type away, and I will actively look for a video that's as long as possible and be like, right, this person's talking about something for 2.5 hours, put it on, plop it in the corner, and I'll listen as I'm kind of doing what I'm doing, and I don't have to keep changing or looking for something new or interesting to put on in the background, you know, and I can still take in something in. So I think actually in many ways, yeah, there's not really any, I don't know, as coming as an artist, I don't like having kind of rules like that. And I probably should think about that more as I do it, and what's the perfect length and this, that, and the other. But I think for me, it's more important to get the meat and bones of what you're saying right and do that justice, however long that will take. Um, get the content and the thing in there and the story in there right. It's actually quite diverse. I think probably Yeah, it's a really good mix of different people. I'm surprised that somehow I've ended up speaking to two Olympian athletes, which I'm like, I didn't, wasn't aware that that was going to be a thing, but that's amazing. There's people who run their own, two people who run their own community-based projects as well, in terms of just smaller ones as well. Activists, one of whom is also a mayor at the moment, um, and then creatives from different fields as well. So I think that for me, it's nice that it's so diverse, and I'm really trying to keep it that way, that there's kind of a theme there of both creativity and some form of community work or activism, but also I don't want it to be too rigid either. I kind of want to keep it, and then no one is kind of too huge as well either. It kind of still feels like this is a regular person that you could have a conversation with, and they're not some unattainable celebrity that was born into status and wealth. And no, it's just these are normal people who've come from an ordinary background and have gone on to do things that might be as amazing as winning an Olympic gold medal, or just building a community project that is helping out people in your area and in the area they're in. And just kind of, yeah, showing that it's, as everyone's saying on the podcast, that it's just about that persistence and patience with yourself and faith in yourself, and finding something that you want to do regardless of what that is, and just starting and keeping going, and seeing that when you really follow that passion, that is such an important thing. Whether that passion is just that I want to put clothes on people's backs in some way, shape, or form, or whether it's I want to do something bigger than that, you just start somewhere and you keep going. And you can, the human potential is amazing, in so many ways and shapes. And I think that's kind of the most common thread in everything. The only thing that I've asked from my guests is not to, there's a section specifically where we kind of go into struggles and difficulties that they face, and that could be anything kind of as vague as professional or something really personal. And the only thing that I ask of them is not to discuss one that they haven't got some form of solution for, because I don't want to kind of go into a heavy topic or a struggling topic and then just bring that up without some form of resolution for people. Because I feel like there's so much of that already. That is what social media is filled with, is people being like, this is what depression feels like, or this is what is going on here in the world. And the thing that, where probably I'm my mum talking, where sometimes I'm very, but I'm like, where is the solution? Where is the thing that you're giving with that? Like, we hear so much about the environmental crisis, but where is this is what you can do? We hear something, and that's the part where that's really important, that if we bring up something that is difficult or challenging, that we also bring up some form of solution or thing that people have used to overcome that, or deal with that along the way. If they can't overcome it, it's like, this is how I make it workable and get on with it. So that's, yeah, there's not a necessarily a topic that is taboo, and we've covered some really massive, huge, difficult topics on it, from genocide and ecocide to mental health difficulties and these kind of things. But for me, it's like, what, as long as there's an action point, something that people can take away that is also positive or constructive out of that difficult conversation, that's really important to me. That I don't just, yeah, bring people's spirits down and make them feel like there's no option, no hope, and just doom and gloom in the world. My granddad's from Africa, from Guinea, Conakry. And so after GCSEs, I went out and lived there for a year in Guinea, Senegal, and the Gambia. And then since then, I've kept connection there. I've also spent some time in North Africa. There's, um, yeah, having lived out there, and compared to just hearing about it, is a different kind of reality as well. And there's kind of so many things going on there that I would love to kind of help to build that bridge a bit more. And I'm looking into and talking to speaking with people there who are building their own projects and things as well, from media stations to fashion labels and amazing things, because I think it's so important to kind of foster that connection, which for some reason never yeah, it's kind of really hard, and those worlds are kind of kept so separate for a reason, I think. Like with, you know, a lot of people know there's Africa, the as a continent has its own Spotify, you know, with its own music library on there, and so many things that they continually have to create for themselves because they're kept so apart from kind of the Western bubble, which I find so sad. And even one of the recent conversations I had with Etienne Scott about part of their Ensure Our Survival campaign was also about the kind of East African crude oil pipeline that is running through there and is massively going to be damaging, not just for the environment, but also for the people that are going to be displaced and moved, and it runs through numerous countries and right by Lake Victoria, one of the biggest things. So for me, it kind of, yeah, it opened up that link to kind of speak with people and stay in contact with people and keep up with information and awareness, because yeah, there's so many things that kind of happen on a constant basis that I think we are very sheltered from here in the Western media, both amazing, incredible things that would, you know, people would be like, wow, I didn't even know that this is happening, and things that are also very kind of sad, which we tend to be more exposed to, but still not kind of made aware of enough. And I think, yeah, going back to that point about conversations and listening to understanding each other, a lot of times, particularly Africa, is not even in people from Africa and from the biggest continent on the planet with over 54 different countries and the most linguistic diversity in the world, are not even at the table to have conversations with people, and are probably the people who most often find themselves spoken for, you know, without having been consulted. And I think that's so important to kind of realize that there's a whole continent full of people who have their own opinions, incredibly diverse opinions, incredibly intellectual. I'm from the part of the world where we built the first libraries, Timbuktu, you know, which people still know about today, but no one will know the history of. So it's like, yeah, it's kind of, yeah, for me, it's always a passion project to learn more and to share as much of that knowledge as possible, because yeah, it's so forgotten. I'm like, one of my massive fascinations is finding out more about the kind of long history between Africa and Asia and in trade and interaction. And as a Buddhist, I have this like obsession of trying to find out whether or not Buddha was a black person, because he has black hair in so many of his earliest depictions. Most of the oldest Buddhist statues are black, literally carved out of black stone or black wood. So, and there was a lot of going back and forth and so much history there in between Africa and Asia that has just been forgotten about it. And yeah, it's just absolutely fascinating and incredible. And I think needs to be revived and spoken about and brought back into consciousness. There's so much that is incredible, even architectural similarities, and then talking about how that could have spread across Polynesia into the Americas. And um, yeah, there's stories as well, kind of in West African history of around about the same time or even before, kind of when you had the stories of the Vikings traveling across, there was also a West African king who sent kind of a huge flotilla across to the Americas because they were aware that there was something there. And so yeah, it's just amazing to kind of uncover and add all of that human history together, because at the end of the day, kind of it completes the picture for all of us about our history. And I think that is, yeah, it's just, for me, love history. I love history no matter where it comes from. I love all our legends and stories and finding about people who came before us. And that is kind of like, I think so many people can, I'm sure, relate to that. It's almost, I think, the similar thing that relates to conspiracy theory, where it's like this is this hidden thing that we haven't been told about, and there's an appeal in that to be like, oh my God, I want to find out more because this was denied to me as a child, you know? It's difficult because it's very country by country basis. So there will be countries where it's going to be a lot easier to kind of find and access local small media. I would probably say that would be the best way to make contact is to go country by country. Some of the countries are going to be a lot more suppressive towards their media landscape. Some countries like mine, Guinea, which when we declared independence from France, we were the only ones in the region pretty much to not join up with the CFRANC, which France still to this day, I'm pretty sure, holds all of the bonds and all of the capital for all of their banks of their ex-colonies in France, and they all join the same financial system. And my country was the only one that didn't join it, so we therefore have a lot less money and then a lot more government coups, and they keep cutting the internet and things like that. And that's a very classic strategy in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, especially, is the second that anything goes on, they all of a sudden the internet and the power goes, especially in a lot of regions, and they are able to kind of that's the classic way to just shut down people's communication. So it will be really hard in those times to then get in contact. Whenever another coup happens, I can never speak to my family for weeks because I'm like, there's no internet, there's no power. So I just have to hope and pray that they're okay. And then maybe sometimes here and there, there'll be a message that gets through and we're like, hey, everyone's okay. Um, but that would be my best probably suggestion would be just contact just generally and just be like, hey, we're looking to get in contact and build a relationship with a local paper, local journalistic, local company, local bloggers, whoever it is that we can kind of find who have a voice and have connection and then can therefore go and speak to ordinary people out here and get that voice, and then we can offer to share that. And yeah, I think yeah, that building that independent media kind of coalition, I think is really important because independent media is definitely, hopefully, kind of um, bringing back some of the journalistic standards that should be rather than what kind of are in the mainstream media at the moment due to corporatism.